So, as we said, not everything they did was good. But history will judge them and Allah will judge them for the deeds that they do. But the point was that they were acknowledged as being a force to be reckoned with for hundreds of years. And there were reports too about how did these people become Muslim. And these reports were given, of course, not by the local Muslims, but by actually the local Christians living in places like Tripoli and Saleh and towns on the north coast of Africa. And they said for the slaves who became Muslim, it was a simple ceremony. They would go to the large mosque in the city and they would simply embrace Islam at the hands of the Imam or the Sheikh there, and off they would go. And not all of them went to sea. Most of them, in fact, did not. The prominent ones that we remember, the ones that I'm talking about tonight, they were the privateers, they were the seafarers, they were the scourge of the Mediterranean. They were, in fact, they regarded themselves as being mujahideen. That's how they regarded themselves. Of course, Europe didn't see them that way. But for those who didn't go to sea, they became tailors and butchers and even imams in the mosques in North Africa. And they married, they had families, and lived there, have been living there ever since. And so the Christians were writing about saying, you know, this is a great worry to them that these people were embracing Islam like this so easily. But for the more noble people, they had a more noble introduction into Islam. They would be generally led through the streets, you know, on horseback, maybe with a military band playing in front of them. And they would sometimes go not to the mosques but to perhaps the shrines of some of the local saints. And those are the sorts of places where they might embrace Islam. As Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad says, that they would generally be circumcised and they would be taught the basics of the Quran, and then they would be sent on their way to lead their lives. This went on for quite a period of time, several hundred years. And surprisingly, even the Americans suffered at the hands of these corsairs, the hands of these Muslim privateers in North Africa. At the time of the American Revolution, of course, America was trading with Europe. There was no more trade with England. They had just had a war with England. They had gained their independence from England. But they wanted to secure treaties with other European countries. And so American ships would go to Europe, go to the Mediterranean, and some American ships were also captured by these corsairs. And the Americans were taken as hostages, and the Americans were made slaves or kept in captivity. So much so that Adams, the president, one of the first presidents of the United States, and Jeffrey made treaties with these people. Although they didn't represent a nation, they were treated as if they were like a nation, a quasi-nation. An autonomous sort of zone, they describe it as, where they had to deal with these people. And so they made treaties with them. And many of the aspects of early American society and culture, especially in its military, were due to the interaction and the treaties that they made with these Muslims from the coast of North Africa. And even things like lines from the Marines' battle hymn refers to events in Tripoli in North Africa, because they had two so-called Barbary wars with these people in North Africa, attempting to quell them attempting to free hostages, attempting to reach some sort of accommodation with them. Because it was only by having a treaty with these people that the Americans could actually trade with other parts of Europe around the Mediterranean. And the American Congress passed a bill where they stated quite clearly that, and as far as in part of their treaty with the Ottomans and the Corsairs, that theirs was a secular country and that they had no difficulty in dealing with the Mohammedans and the Mussulmans. Whereas, of course, some of the hawks in the American government were saying that we should do things to attack these people and we should fight them. We shouldn't be making treaties with them. We should be going to war against them and exterminating them completely to safeguard our way of life. And of course, when you read the history of this, it's not hard to find parallels with even what's happening today. And although history, as we say, is a foreign country, sometimes, even when we visit foreign countries, we see things there which are very familiar to us. And when we look at the history of these particular events from the 16th to the 19th centuries about these corsairs, these Muslim privateers, we see that they had a tremendous impact and influence on Europe and also on America. It's also intriguing, one of the things I read about when looking at this topic, these corsairs didn't just confine themselves to the Mediterranean. They went out into the Atlantic, down the west coast of Africa, and north to England, to Ireland, and even as far north as Iceland, which is up towards the Arctic Circle, making raids there, making their presence felt. And one of the most famous, well-known raids was conducted in the south of Ireland. And I find it interesting because my father comes from the south of Ireland. And it's interesting to think that perhaps during that raid on the town of Baltimore in Western Cork, where 100 hostages were taken in the raid, men, women, children, and they were never heard of again, at least by the people in Cork, and taken presumably to North Africa, where they were either sold as slaves, or they became Muslim, or they were married off, the women, to men there. And it's interesting to think that perhaps some of my ancestors may have been amongst them. And it just goes to show you also, when you look at history, and when you look at stories like this, that you begin to see how closely connected we really all are. Whereas we tend to think that these people are foreigners, that they have an existence which is completely separate from us, that we have never ever had anything much in common. Our paths have never ever crossed at all. And yet when we look at history, and we look at some aspects of history, we see that paths do cross. And by the grace of God, we end up travelling or moving or being in one place or another. So that's the story, a little bit of background about some of these infamous Muslims. You won't read much about them in history books, but if you scratch a little bit beneath the surface, you can find out a little bit about them and about the parts that they played. And inshallah, although some of them were not the best role models, there were some very good ones amongst them. And it just goes